get the first lessons? The first?
I think I put both of them on, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That works.
And they're just fun discussions, and about right now it's all about the period of the Hasmoneans, which, you know, the story of Hellenism and Judah Maccabee. And so it's like, you know, still so early, but it's like the connection between the sages and that period, the Maccabees, is the early sages were during the period of the Maccabees. So it's kind of fun to think about it from that perspective, not to mention to think of, because we know some of the Hanukkah story, and we know some of that which is going on in Israel during this time of Hellenization. And so it's kind of, it adds to the significance of the message that they're sharing. All right, 7:03. I think we're gonna start. So Rabbi Gold is here. First of all, top left corner is Rabbi Neal Gold. He's just Neal Gold in his square, but I promise you that that's just because he doesn't want to get too snooty, but that he's a rabbi. I know this with certainty because Neal was one of my closest friends at Hebrew Union College. We were actually on different campuses for most of our time, but we were together in our first year in Jerusalem. And when you listen and learn from Neal, I think you're going to get a sense as to why he would have been one of my friends, right? You're going to just you're going to realize, oh yeah, we can see why Ari liked this guy. The point is that Neal first of all, he's an extraordinary mind, and he has really devoted himself. You know, he stopped serving in the, you know, on a day-to-day basis in the pulpit, and is focusing on teaching and education, and he's extraordinary academic, and we're just very fortunate to have him here. But he's also just an extraordinary person, and I think that you will see that. I mean, he's an exceedingly genuine and real and kind and gentle individual, a person who I feel so honored to be able to call him a friend. He has values that are, I mean, he has a value system which is so admirable. His care for he has a whole life of experiences with social action and with working with Tikkun Olam, both in Israel and in America. And look, I admire him very much. And and I think you'll understand why soon. I'm not going to go into too much more about his bio, and the reason why is because I think you'll get a better sense just kind of after, you know, it's not like it's a one-time class. This is a 3-class experience. Now, you don't have to come to all 3, but my guess is you're going to want to come to the remaining 2 after this, because you're going to find this one so meaningful. But nonetheless, so there are 3 classes that each will be different, but all kind of within the context of social justice and Tikkun Olam and Judaism. And I feel just very fortunate to have Neal here. So Neal, I'm going to let you, from this point forward, it's really all Neal. So if you have questions, I'll help by moderating a little bit, just by kind of chiming in if necessary. But this is really Neal teaching, and I'm just a learner here with you. So I hope I hope you are able to really grow from the experience with Rabbi Gold. And I turn it over to you, Neal, at this point, and it's all you. I'm going to mute myself so I don't disturb.
I got to say, that is one of the most gracious and generous and fun introductions that I've ever had, that I'll never in a million years be able to live up to. But just know that I feel the same way, and it's all quite reciprocated towards Rabbi Goldstein. I presume all of you know what a jewel he is, and what a gift and a blessing he is to the Beth Shalom community. And I just feel the same way. And we laugh way too much when we're together, and we're together not frequently enough. And I miss you terribly. On the other hand, I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to be invited to come do some learning together with your community. I'm really, really delighted, and I hope that we have the opportunity to get beneath the surface and to get to know one another a little bit during these sessions. I don't tend to teach by lecturing or by over talking. I love Jewish texts, and I want to share with you a love for Jewish texts. And I tend to teach through discussion and questions and answers and exploration. So I hope that all of you will feel really comfortable to interject, to ask questions, to answer my questions, and we'll see where this goes together. I want to say a few words about how Rabbi Goldstein and I selected this topic that we're going to share together tonight and in these future sessions. So away we go, and thank you. So as Rabbi Goldstein and I were brainstorming together some of the topics that we might share together, I wanted to point towards some of these themes of Tikkun Olam that, as he mentioned in the introduction, I've been exploring and studying and grappling with for much of my adult life. And I wanted to teach a class about Tikkun Olam, but I want to say a few words about what this isn't. And what this isn't is a survey, just class by class, of a series of different social causes or social issues and talking about what the Jewish view on those things is supposed to be. We could do that. I think it's overdone, and I don't think that that's necessarily my role, or even something I particularly enjoy, to point to people about how they're supposed to think about certain social issues. What I really wanted to do was to put together a course that's a study about the foundations of Jewish social ethics, about when we talk about social justice and the issues related to it, where does this imperative come from? Where does this idea of tikkun olam, world repair, the pursuit of freedom and peace that permeates what it means to be a Jew, what are the essential values where these come from? What are the assumptions and the principles that underpin Jewish action? And when I started thinking about it that way, I got to a series of big topics that I thought we might share together. And between this week and the future classes that we're going to do together, I want to explore some of these big ideas about the nature of biblical justice, about how the sources suggest that we best take care of one another, about what it means to say somebody is a ger, a resident alien in your community, as opposed to the question of who is my brother and sister and what are my responsibilities towards that person. Those are some of the themes I want to explore in our time together this week and in future sessions. For tonight, I wanted to, for our first time together, our first class together, I wanted to explore this idea of Tselem Elohim, about what it means to be made in the image of God. It's a little bit of a cliche. We say it so often in the liberal Jewish world that it rolls off our lips so easily. And I don't think we stop to explore the idea or even to say, what does that really mean? And yet it's so important, because I believe that the jumping off point of all subsequent Jewish ethics begins with this idea of human beings uniquely are made in the image of God. But for such a well-known phrase and such a well-known concept, it's actually pretty far from obvious what it actually means. For such a well-known phrase, it's surprising that the phrase image of God only appears 3 times in the entire Bible. And those 3 times are kind of front-loaded right at the beginning of the Torah. And we're going to take a look at them. And then what I want to do in our short time together tonight is to explore in the first half of our class, what does the Torah literally mean when it says human beings are made in the image of God? And then in the remaining time that we have, to take a look at some of the specific Jewish applications of that idea. So let's take a minute. Let's call this a rhetorical question rather than one for discussion. But as a rhetorical question, let's just take a moment of reflection and say, for each of us, when you hear the phrase, in the image of God, what are the first thoughts that come to you? Let's just think about that for a second and take a few moments of reflection, and then we'll turn to the texts. What does it mean to say in the image of God?
May I comment?
You may. Who is that?
This is Paul Schatzberg.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Sure, you can.
Well, when we walk along the street and the sun is shining behind us, it projects an image of us, which is a shadow, a two-dimensional image of the three-dimensional body. In the case of God, it is a multi-dimensional image that is projected to human beings. So we can only grasp a portion of it because God is multi-dimensional and we are three-dimensional. And that's the best we can do.
What a beautiful image that is. And it's, I'm going to riff on what you just said, Paul, because I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about it. That for some people, our experience of God is kind of refracted through our experience with other human beings. That's what the great philosopher Martin Buber believed, that the sum of our knowledge of God comes from our interactions with other human beings, the unique image of God in the world. Paul, did you ever read Flatland?
Yes.
It sounded like you did. Flatland is one of the most spiritual books I ever read in my life, even though I was first introduced to it in a high school math class. Flatland is about a land of two-dimensional creatures so they live in a plane, in a geometric plane, but a three-dimensional creature enters their world. And at first they can't comprehend what 3 dimensions possibly means because they only live in a world of 2 dimensions. And slowly they figure it out. And clearly the point of Flatland is to say how we three-dimensional creatures living in a three-dimensional world can begin to comprehend things above and beyond our understanding of reality and of existence. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. It's very much a way of understanding what our experience of God is, if you're a follower of Martin Buber. Okay, well, let's go back to the text. Let's go to the source itself. And I told you the phrase itself appears in only 3 places in the entire Bible. That's very convenient for us because that means we have time that we can actually explore them. And of course, this takes us back to the earliest chapters of creation, the earliest chapters of the book of Genesis. So if you've got the source sheets that I sent out earlier, great. You can take a look at the first text on the top of page 1. If you didn't get those, I put a link to it in the chat, and I'm also going to share them on our screen. Hopefully you can see that right now. Here we go. So the first text, naturally enough, is from Genesis chapter 1, because Genesis chapter 1 is one of the stories of creation that's found in the Hebrew Bible. There are, in fact, several. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, and then there's some other echoes of creation sagas sprinkled throughout the rest of the Tanakh. But that's a story for another time. In Genesis chapter 1, the paragraph that I have at the top of the screen here, this is the culmination of the creation story. Genesis chapter 1 is famously very orderly and formulaic. Over 6 days, a world comes into being. And formulaic, I mean, each paragraph kind of has this repetitive nature to it. God speaks and says, let there be such and such to come into existence. Then something new comes into being. Then God looks and sees that it is good. And then the narrator says there was evening and there was morning, a first day, a second day, a third day, etc. But each day gets a little bit more complex, from the brief, let there be light and there was light, to the creation of diverse organisms filling the land and sea and sky. The language becomes more complicated, becomes more rich. It's like the language of the Torah itself expresses the increasing biodiversity that's appearing on the earth. And by the arrival of human beings, the final act of creation, there are many, many more words to describe what has come into being. The creation of human beings is unique for a variety of reasons. The verbs that are used, well, let's take a look. Here's Genesis chapter 1, verses 26, 27, 28, which are on our page. Uniquely, amongst all the creation that's come into being in the previous 25 verses, human beings are going to be made in the image of the Creator. Vayomer Elohim na'aseh adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. And God said, let us make the human being. The word for human being is Adam. I point that out because I think it's important to know that the Hebrew word Adam in Genesis means human being. It's not the guy's name, but it's the generic term for the proto-human that is created here. And the text later goes out of its way to say this proto-human is both male and female. The rabbis in the Midrash have a familiar word for this, androgynos, which is, well, you can figure out what that means.
May I
No matter how
comment?
your ancient Greek skills happen to be. Give me 1 second, Paul. Let me finish this thought. Let us make the human being in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth. And God created man in God's image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. And then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth. So there's a whole college semester that could be taught about these 3 sentences that we just read. And I don't want to talk about all the details about it tonight. I want to just zoom in on this phrase right here at the beginning that says, the human being was made bitsalmenu kidmutenu, in our image after our likeness. Of course, there are lots and lots of headaches that this sentence has caused Bible readers for hundreds and hundreds of years, namely the plural form. What's the us in let us create? It's such a big question that I kind of don't want to talk about it tonight. I kind of want to focus on the idea of tselem and demut, this idea of whatever is doing the creating, human beings are going to be in that. We have 2 words here, tselem and demut. Tselem, what does our translation say? In our image, in our likeness. Those 2 words, some commentators just say that those 2 words are synonyms, that the human being is made in the Creator's image, in the Creator's likeness. Others point out that they're slightly different words that have slightly different meanings. The word tselem goes back to a pre-Hebrew cognate that means a statue. In the Bible itself, a tselem seems to be a physical representation of something in the world. And that's significant because the second word, demut, means to be similar or to be like something. And at least one contemporary commentator on this says the 2 words together, the second one kind of blurs the meaning. The demut blurs the meaning of the tselem a little bit. It is a radical idea to say that a human being is like a statue of God in the world. The second word, demut, says, yeah, but not really. It kind of softens the harsh edges of such an idea. It's almost like a dreamlike image, that in a dream, you can see something really, really clearly. then you wake up in the morning and try to describe to somebody what you saw in that dream, and suddenly it gets really blurry really quickly. That's kind of the relationship between Selim and Demut in this first verse. Okay, I wanted to get all of that out before taking comments and responses. Paul, you were going to say something, and I'll be glad to
I
hear
have
it.
a problem with the second chapter of Genesis, which says, Yud He Vav He formed the human from the dust of the earth. And Adam really means Adamah, earth. Adamah is earth. So Adam is an earthling. But this is true. This is still early. He hasn't become a man. He hasn't become a male until he sees Eve, until he beholds Eve, and he becomes a male agenda.
Okay, so there's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there in what you said. I do want to go to that second chapter and look at how it parallels, amplifies, even mitigates what happened in chapter 1. I just don't want to go too quickly. Is it okay with everybody if you got the idea of, in chapter 1, it says we're going to make this human being in a tselem and demut, in the image and likeness of the Creator. Everybody got that? You do. Then where Paul is pushing us to, in chapter 2, this phrase doesn't appear, in the image of. Instead, we got something different. In chapter 2, we have a different creation story that sounds like this. Adonai Elohim. This is the way I write the name of God, Adonai. You can figure out how you'd like to pronounce it. But Adonai Elohim formed the human being from the dust of the earth. God blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human being became a living being. Adonai planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed the human being, the Adam, there, whom God had formed. To Paul's point, there's Midrash and a lot of Kabbalah that talks about that first human being being both male and female. As it said in chapter 1, male and female was this proto-human. And in these Midrashic texts, they talk about that human being being surgically kind of split in half. That the first proto-human was both genders. And then what happened with the creation of Eve was not like we were told when we were children, that she was made from Adam's rib. The classical Midrash from hundreds and hundreds of years ago rejected that idea. Instead spoke of the creation of male and female sort of as like mitosis of a cell, of splitting in half a male side and a female side, both equally parts of that first proto-human being. But there's something really remarkable about chapter 2 that I want to share with you from a contemporary teacher. Listen to it again. God formed the human being from the dust of the earth. And the Midrash talks about God taking dust from all the different parts of the earth, scooping it up together and shaping it into a proto-human being. So the lesson that I'm about to teach, I learned from a teacher of mine from many years ago. His name is Yitzhak Buxbaum. Yitzhak Buxbaum has written some beautiful, beautiful books about Jewish spirituality, about Hasidism. Rabbi Goldstein, he wrote a beautiful book about Hillel, about the life and teachings of Hillel for that Pirkei Avot class that you're teaching. And he says, what's going on here? this God creating this human being from the dust of the earth. In fact, rather than retell it, I've put what Yitzhak's words on the page here. By the way, Yitzhak Buxbaum, I only recently found out, passed away about a year ago, I believe from COVID. He was a very special teacher, and his books are deeply spiritual Jewish books. And he talks about this. The story of humanity's creation portrays God, so to speak, as a man who scoops up clay from the ground and sculpts a little man in his own image, a small model of himself. But what human activity is being pictured here? This, of course, is a parable. God is not scooping up dirt. And every parable is based on something in real life. What real life scene is the basis for this graphic parable of God sculpting a little person? It is that of a sculptor who works with clay to produce a little image of a man. And what did that mean in ancient Israel? In the world of ancient Israel and the rest of early antiquity, the actual context of sculpting a human figurine was the age-old trade of an idol maker. Now, you don't have to know much about the Torah to know that one of the big principles of the Torah is its invectives against idolatry and idol worship, right? So he thinks this is really interesting, this idea of right at the beginning of Genesis, this image of the creator acting like an idol maker, making a little idol of himself, this human being in the world. Listen to this. I'm going down to this third paragraph here. Although God is pictured as an idol maker, this story contains a radical anti-idolatry message. The idolaters made statues which they said were the images of their God, and to win the god's favor, they ritually served and worshiped the idol. But the story of humanity's creation out of clay, yet in God's image, teaches the very opposite, that idols of clay are false and empty. By contrast, the Torah says that the true idol, the true image of God, which should have our utmost respect and reverence, is the human beings themselves. The true worship of God is not the ritual temple service of a lifeless image devoid of ethics, with no necessary link to justice and mercy. The true worship of God is the love, service, and worship, in quotes, of living human beings who are veritably in the divine image. He says a lot more, but I'll take that down from the screen, for instance, and just say, I think this is a fairly astonishing insight from a contemporary writer about what's going on in this passage of the Torah that we've all read a million times about God taking the dust of the earth and shaping a human being out of it. He says, this is one way of understanding the Torah's veritable obsession with condemning the worship of idols. Because
Rabbi
there's
Gold, can I ask you a question really quickly about this?
Already an idol of God in the world, as it were, and that is your neighbor and every other human being that you come and interact with.
Rabbi Gold, can I
Rabbi,
just out of curiosity, what do we know about Yitzhak Buxbaum? Was he is he religious? Is he Orthodox? Is he...
Oh yeah. Yitzhak was this beautiful guy. He was when I encountered him, he was living and teaching and learning in the Hasidic communities in Brooklyn. I mean, he self-identifies himself as a Hasidic Jew. I met him, Rabbi, in the libraries of Hebrew Union College, where you and I went to school, because he would come and use our library. And in the afternoons, this is going back to the 1990s when we were seminary students, in New York, we used to run a weekly soup kitchen and feed hundreds of hungry people each week. And Yitzhak would come and hang out, and he would watch what we were doing, and he would come and talk to me. And the first time I ever heard him teach this lesson was, he said, I just love this place, and I love the work that you guys are doing. would you ever give me permission, maybe after one night of feeding dinner to all these people, could I teach some Torah to your volunteers? And I said, sure. And this was the lesson that he taught. He taught about how serving other people with respect and love and dignity is akin to the service of God. And it made a deep impression on me. And it also, made a deep impression on me about, here was a guy who self-identifies as a Hasidic Jew and loved being around the Reform Rabbinical Seminary and interacting with those students.
Could we please talk about Genesis 2:7-8, where it says, God blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. So Adam was not a living being until God blew the breath of life. In other words, it was ruach, it's ruach, the divine breath. So that means that all of us, and especially the men, have divine breath. And became alive by divine breath.
Oh, but Paul, I was with you until the last thing you said. What do you mean, especially the men? Not
Yes.
especially the men. All human beings, every human being has, it seems to say, this, you're not just a clod, a lump of matter. You have this animating spirit of the divine within you. We call that nishama, which comes from the Hebrew word nishima, which means to take a breath. Did I do okay?
Yes,
Paul?
yes.
Okay. It appears, the phrase appears two more. I'm going to move us along. The phrase appears two more places. At the end of the Garden of Eden stories, it sort of sums up the saga of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden experience in Genesis chapter 5. Oops, I got to put it back on screen. Sorry. In Genesis chapter 5, where it reminds us, this is the record of Adam's line. When God created the first human being, God made that person be Demut Elohim, in the likeness of God. And then it repeats it a little bit later. But I think, oh, no, it doesn't. It says something important. In verse 3, it says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he begot a son. And how does it describe Adam's son? Bidmuto kitsalmo. That the same language for which God created human beings, now it seems like human beings can replicate themselves by making other little human beings. Has Alexander gone to sleep? I suspect that he has, because he's not on the screen anymore. Oh, no, there he is, Stacy and Alexander. There you are. So one of the awesome things about childbirth is the creation of little yous, but also there's this echo of what God did in Genesis chapter 1. God creates people in the divine likeness, and then human beings get to act godlike by creating little human beings in their likeness. And that's part of the awe of parenthood that's built in right here in the beginning of Genesis. Okay. But I told you there's 3 places where this phrase appears. It appears one more time in the entire Bible. And it's just a few verses later, a few chapters later. In Genesis chapter 9, the phrase appears again. Let me give the context. The context is after the flood and Noah's Ark. After the flood has happened, which I consider the flood to be creation 2.0. God says, this one didn't work. I'm starting over again with Noah and his family, and this is it. This is the last time I'm doing this, creating the world, wiping it out, starting over again, creation 2.0. And this time God describes to Noah, upon the leaving from the ark, some new parameters for human behavior. some new rules, a little bit more realistic and less idealistic than what was found in the Garden of Eden. Things like the permission to eat meat is one of the big ones, which apparently didn't exist in the Garden of Eden. But after Noah and his family come out of the ark, they say, all right, I'm going to make a concession to human beings. If you want, you can eat meat, with a whole lot of restrictions and rules. You can. And then in this passage, as the people are coming out of the ark, God says these words slightly or very enigmatically. Speaking in poetry, we have this verse: Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishapech, ki b'tselem Elohim asa et ha'adam. In poetic form, God says to Noah, whoever sheds the blood of human beings, by other human beings shall his blood be shed. Why? Because in the Tselem Elohim, in the divine image, did God create human beings. What's interesting to me about this is the Torah now adds an explicitly ethical dimension to something that was just kind of this nice, beautiful, profound idea. Human beings uniquely are made in God's image. Now it's got an ethical dimension to it. Because human beings are made in God's image, therefore you're supposed to behave a certain way. What's that certain way? Don't kill. Don't murder. If you shed somebody else's blood, there's going to be punishment for that. Why? Because human beings uniquely are made in the image of God. Now I want to talk about all the ethics about what that means. And, there's always someone, especially if you're teaching this to teenagers, there's somebody in the classroom. Well, what about if you're a soldier in a war? Or what about if you're this? That's not what I want to talk about tonight. I just want to point out that there's been a progression. In the creation story, there was this idea of the image of God, but it didn't tell us too much about what the implications of that idea were. By the time the human beings come out of Noah's Ark, we're reminded that we're made in the image of God, and it has certain implications ethically about how we're going to behave. A progression has occurred. What we might have intuited at first is now made explicit. The image gives dignity and worth to human beings, and it kind of sets them apart from the animal kingdom, which are now permitted for food, among other things. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But let me exhale for a second and say, does anybody have any questions or comments or arguments about anything that we've talked about thus far? Am I doing? Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. First of all, let me take it down from so I can see you all. And James, yes.
I was wondering why are animals not holy or in the image, and especially in the light of the fact that there was no meat eating in the Garden of Eden and only started after the flood. In other words, does this not devalue the natural creatures?
Yeah. I think it's not meant. Okay, well, let's go there. I think the answer to your question is that there's a certain conclusion that we can draw from all of this. And it has to do with what human beings' place in the divine schema is all about. That human beings occupy a unique niche in the divine plan. Here's what I mean, James, and I'll say a whole bunch, and then I really want to hear your response to this, because I've been thinking hard about this question. On one hand, Genesis chapter 1 emphasizes that human beings are part and parcel of God's creation. Just as animals and plants and the heavenly bodies and oceans and the sky and all that are part of the divine plan, so too are human beings part of that jigsaw puzzle. And on the other hand, all this different language There's different verbs that are used when human beings are created. There's this idea of in the image. There's a whole lot more, different vocabulary indicates that human beings are separate and distinct from the animal kingdom as well at the same time. That they're somewhere in between. Let me show you. I think the clearest statement of this is in one of my favorite Psalms in the Bible, Psalm number 8, which I happen to include for you on page 4 in your packet. I'll put it up on the screen in a minute. Psalm number 8 celebrates human beings' place in the created order. And it's going to say this point that I've been trying to make. We're kind of the animal kingdom, but not really. And in some ways, we're a little bit godlike. We're the image of God, but not really. We're somewhere in between. And that puts the human being's place in the taxonomy of creation in a unique spot. So Psalm number 8, which is really, like I said, one of my favorites and one of the most exquisite poems to be found in the Bible, makes this theme. It's a celebration of the awe of creation, but it makes a point about the human being's place in creation. I won't read the whole thing just for the sake of time. Let's just look at like 4, 5, and 6, when the poet is looking out around at the awesomeness of creation and is almost overwhelmed by it. Listen to what he says. When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, what is man? I'm going to use the language here that's in this translation. I don't like man. I've already told you where it should say human being, but I don't want to screw up the poem either. What is man that you have been mindful of him? Mortal man that you have taken note of him, that you have made him little less than divine and adorned him with glory and majesty. Look at the Hebrew. Taxrehu vatchasrehu ma'at me Elohim. Human beings are a little bit less than Elohim, a little bit less than God, God's self, as it were. V'chavod v'hadar tatrehu, and you've crowned human beings with these two very mystical words, kavod and hadar. Our translation says glory and majesty, but know that they're even more spiritual words than that. Do you hear it? That in this ladder of this hierarchy of creation, there's the natural world, which has its own blessing and its own beauty and its own awe in it. There's God, and human beings are somewhere in between. They're in and of the animal kingdom, but also sort of transcend the animal kingdom. That's kind of the best I can do with it. But the poet of the psalm, says it really exquisitely, I think. So James, how did I do with the answer to your question?
Late in my life,
We can't hear you.
late in my life, I've tried to move towards vegetarianism because I realize that animals do not have reason and free will, but they do suffer pain, and also a reverence for the planet itself means that excess meat eating is damaging. So yes, of course, I recognize your view that there's something special about human beings that requires their respect, but also for other creatures.
Well, what's interesting at this point is that the writers of this text thousands of years ago didn't know anything about neuroscience. We know a lot about neuroscience today, and in fact, the human brain, in terms of its complexity that it evolved into, represents a a dimension beyond animals, even the closest chimpanzees and bonobos, but they don't have the capacity that we have for reason, analysis, and what we're doing today with you.
Fair enough.
Rabbi
I mean, I
Gold,
think we're saying similar points. To James' point, though, you're exactly right. By the way, as far as Jewish ethics go, they acknowledge, Jewish ethics acknowledges everything that you put out there about animals having cognition, animals having knowing pain, and a whole lot more than that. The sort of thing that anyone who owns a pet or has had any sort of close relation to an animal would say, yeah, duh, obviously. But so you're right. Everything that you said, James, is in good keeping with an important strand of Jewish ethics.
Rabbi Gold, can I ask a question about, and maybe get us back on target and maybe make a comment on
Yes,
something
please.
you were saying before, having to do with Genesis 9 and the divine image reference in Genesis 9. It seems to me a little bit self-serving, right? If you have a God who says, don't kill because you're made in my image. In other words, you are in some way trying to kill me or trying to erase, if you're in my, if humans are made in my image and you kill, therefore you are therefore trying to somehow get rid of me. Is there any, is there anything to that comment?
That's not what I hear. That's not what I hear in it. I just hear saying there's something sublime and awesome about the human creation, even more because of what I've said, because of this place in this hierarchy, that there's something sublime about the human spirit. And to say, to take a human life is an act of such profundity that that's what the text is going for here. I think to say that this idea of image of God, which has been a descriptive term up to this point, now is a term that has real life ethical implications. I don't think it's about your diminishing me, God, in the world, but I think that there's this sense of awesomeness and distinction of every individual human being. That's where I think the Jewish tradition takes this idea, at least.
No doubt, but as
It's
I
like-
was only thinking about it from after we've had this conversation, going through all these texts, I'm now seeing the last version of B'Tselem Elohim,
Yeah.
and it's talking about don't kill. You shouldn't shed blood of man. By man shall his blood be shed, because you're made in the divine image, right? In other words, and so therefore, killing man is like killing me. And I was only just kind of, I don't know. I mean, I of course I understand how our tradition has understood it, but I'm just trying to kind of open my mind to other possibilities as we're studying this text right now. But I think that, but I want you to keep going with what you were teaching before.
Well, okay, along those lines, let me show you one other thing from the ancient Near Eastern point of view of one other thing that I think is worth getting really excited about this idea. And that would be to say this: where does ancient Israel get this idea from? We know that like much of the Torah, not everything in the Torah, but much of the Torah has antecedents before the Torah was written from the other ancient cultures that pre-existed Israel. Where did ancient Israel get this idea? Is it something new of a fresh cloth, or did they borrow it? Well, we know that ancient Israel was largely influenced by the cultures all around it, most especially by two great empires, the one to the south and to the west, which was ancient Egypt, and the culture to the east, which was ancient Babylonia. And it's striking that in both of those cultures, in Babylonian culture and in Egyptian culture, they had this idea of a human being made in the image of God, but not the same way that the Torah understood it. Look at the images that I put on page 3 in your packet. I'll put them up on the screen. That might look familiar. Anybody old enough to remember the 1970s when America and the whole world was sort of caught up in a wave of like Egypt fever, and the treasures of King Tutankhamun, King Tut, made the rounds of all like the great museums in America.
And Steve Martin sang a song about it too.
I was going to say it if you weren't going to say it. On Saturday Night Live too, right? King Tut. Well, in ancient Egypt, pharaohs, the kings, the pharaohs were often perceived this way. There he is himself, the handsome devil on the top of the screen. That's the golden death mask of the boy pharaoh, whose name was Tutankhamun, who reigned in the 14th century BCE. And King Tutankhamun, his name, if you break it up into its phonetic pieces in ancient Egyptian, means literally the living image of the god Amun. And he wasn't so unique with an honorary name like this. You can go to the British Museum if you want to see all the great archaeological relics of ancient Israel and the ancient Near East. Go to the British Museum and you see this granite bust of a pharaoh who preceded King Tut himself, whose royal name was Menkhperure, which means the likeness of the god Re. And there's other examples of this, but here's the point I'm going for, that in ancient Egypt, pharaohs were often perceived with names that is, they're the living likeness of one of the Egyptian gods in the Egyptian pantheon. In other words, the terminology itself emphasizes that the king was godlike, and by implication, greater than ordinary people. Why am I telling you all this? Because look at the agenda of what the Torah does. The Torah knows this, that their neighbors in Egypt and Babylonia have this idea of human beings made in the image of God. But the human beings that those neighbors were talking about were the kings of the empires. And now you see the radical agenda of the Torah, how it democratizes a well-known idea that existed in the ancient world. Because the Torah comes along to say, bless you. The Torah comes along to say, it comes along to say, bless you, actually, but it also comes along to say that it's not just the king, but every human being without exception that bears the stamp of royalty, that bears this image of the one God of creation. And that is astonishing and it's radical. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about that. So I'm going to sum it up again. In the ancient world, there was a belief that the kings were the living image of the gods. The Torah doesn't reject that idea. It harnesses it to its own kind of radical agenda that says, yes, there is a living image of God in the world, but it's not just the king, and it's not just the nobleman, and it's not just the rich person or the politically powerful person. It's every human being that you come into contact with over the course of the day. And isn't that astonishing to think about? So to sum up our big takeaways so far, that the place of human beings in creation is unique as sort of the special creations of God. And then we have this idea of the democratization of human beings by tempering the ancient Near Eastern ideas and saying that every human being is made in this image. And then Genesis 9 comes along to say, and with that understanding, there are certain ethical responsibilities that you and I have that come from this awareness. How am I doing so far?
Excellent, and it's radical, and it's fascinating.
Okay, good.
Rabbi
No, it
Neal,
is. It's fascinating. I love it, and it emerges from that from the Buxbaum idea, which is also fascinating too.
I
Yeah,
thought you- okay.
Rabbi, if I could mention again about that, the Buxbaum idea,
Yes.
with man being created in God's image, like a maker working in clay, particularly in the very beginning of Genesis, when it seems as if God is referred to in the plural. To take a very negative perspective on it, you could see this elevation of human beings and esteem for human beings as a form of idol worship, which I don't think is your idea here.
No, Yitzhak Buxbaum's idea was the opposite, to say the outrage of idol worship is that it misplaces where awe and attention and respect is supposed to be given, because there's already a likeness of the divine walking around in the world. And it's not in a statue, or it's not in the work of somebody's hands, it's in your neighbor, especially your neighbor who's hurting and needs your attention.
Also, Rabbi, the Israeli human rights organization that calls itself B'Tselem takes advantage of that, because it means that all human beings have an equal right to justice.
Outrageous, right? Yes, they knew what they were doing by naming themselves that, for sure. Yeah, you got it. Mhm. Well, I got about 15 more minutes. Let's take a look at some. I told you that's everything that the Tanakh has to say explicitly about this idea, but I want to show you some things that Jewish tradition says about this idea that takes these implications of everything that we've said so far. That this idea that human beings have this special niche, that this great democratizing idea of the image of God, that it applies to everybody, and that there are certain ethical responsibilities that flow from this idea. The packet that I've given you is full of great, juicy Jewish texts. We're not going to get to too many of them in the time we have together, but I give them to you to take and study on your own afterwards, and I hope you enjoy them. But let's take a look, for starters, at the one that's on the bottom of page 4, because that's a pretty important one. At the bottom of page 4 is a famous midrash, sort of a classic debate. It's a little bit contrived, but between two of the great figures that Rabbi Goldstein will sooner or later get to in your Pirkei Avot class on Wednesday mornings. These two great figures from the first and second century of the Common Era are going to have a little, like I said, a little bit of a contrived debate with one another about what's the most important verse in the entire Torah. Okay. And that brings us to this passage here. It's from a midrash on the book of Leviticus called the Sifra, and the debate between Rabbi Akiva and his colleague, who's known as Ben Azai, his name is Shimon Ben Azai, about what's their favorite, most important verse in the entire Torah. First, because it's a midrash on Leviticus, the first passage, pretty good place to start, is V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Right at the heart of the Torah, we read it on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. We read this passage, love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi, no less a figure than Rabbi Akiva himself, the towering figure of rabbinic Judaism from 1900 years ago. Rabbi Akiva says, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is the great fundamental principle of the Torah. Nice. His contemporary, Ben Azai, says, Zeh sefer toldot Adam. This is the record of Adam's line. When God created the first human being, God made Adam in the likeness of God. Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. He says, Zeh klal gadol mizeh. This is an even greater principle than that one. Who's right? It's a little bit silly, right? Arguing over what's the great fundamental overarching principle of the Torah. But Rabbi Akiva says, love your neighbor as yourself. Ben Azai says, human beings are made in the image of God? Who's right?
Akiva,
Why?
the phrase that uh, the phrase of love your neighbor as yourself is so simple and so straightforward that there can be no question about what its meaning is.
That's so funny to me that you say that, Paul. And Paul, it is, may I say, it is such a pleasure to get to know you and to have you in this class. I really appreciate all the comments you're making. It's amazing that you would say that, because when I've taught this before, I've had somebody, and there's usually someone in the classroom, it's usually a high school student, who'll say, well, wait a minute. You think love your neighbor as yourself is straightforward? I think it is pretty straightforward, except for one thing. What does love mean? Who's your neighbor? And what does it mean as yourself? Other than that, it's totally straightforward. Because love is a little bit ambiguous. Who's your neighbor? You can imagine this very easily being manipulated and saying, well, my neighbor is me and the person who lives next door and across the street, but the people in the next town over, let alone the people in the next country over, they're monsters and screw them. But you can imagine somebody even manipulating this text that somebody as ethical as you, Paul, says couldn't be more straightforward and plain. You can imagine somebody manipulating it. Ben Azai comes along and says, no, every human being, even those people who you can't stand, still have the image of God made in them. I don't know who's right, on this, but I will point out, and from this, I learned from my teacher, and maybe Rabbi Goldstein's too. I mean, you were out there in Cincinnati. Did you ever study with Norman Cohen?
I did. I studied with him, but not for a semester. I studied various different sessions with him. Yes.
Rabbi Norman Cohen is one of my favorite teachers and a great teacher of Midrash. And I remember learning this text from him. And he points out two interesting things. One is he points out that the editor of the Midrash seems to give Ben Azai the last word, as if to say he agrees with him, that the image of God is this overarching principle. But even more strikingly, he says, what do we know about Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai? They both lived at a time of awful oppression of the Jewish people under the Romans. We know the demise of Rabbi Akiva, described in the Talmud, is particularly grotesque and awful, as he was executed and tortured slowly, painfully, and disgustingly in the public town square. Ben Azai's demise was of the same generation of these Jewish martyrs to Rome. And Rabbi Cohen, I remember him teaching us, saying, you might have expected that in a generation like that, it would be natural enough to circle the wagons and teach a lesson of Jewish particularity, Jewish uniqueness. We Jews, we suffer, but we're better than everybody else. And he says, how amazing it is that in exactly that sort of context, we still find this ethic that comes pouring out of the text that says, no, everybody made in the image of God, even our enemies, even our tormentors. We still recognize that in their humanness, there's an element of the divine, no matter how buried it is. There's another way of understanding this, by the way, in the Talmud. There's a classic image in the Talmud that you've probably seen before. And that's this passage on the screen here from the Talmud Sanhedrin. This is an incredible drush for Passover. And this is an incredible text to share at a Passover Seder. And I'll tell you why. It's talking about the moment of the Passover story when the sea splits and Israel goes through on dry land, and then the sea closes. And at that moment, we know for us that Egyptian slavery is a thing of the past, and we're free people. And we sing. We start to sing to God. Well, listen to this. The Talmud says at that moment, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, at the moment when Israel crossed through the Red Sea and the sea closed in on the Egyptians, the ministering angels were about to burst into song before the Holy One. And God turns to the angels and says, Silence. Maaseh yadai tovim bayam. My handiwork is drowning in the sea, and you would dare sing to me. That's a breathtaking midrash, because you have to think about it for a minute. When you read Egyptians in the Passover story, in the Haggadah, you read Egyptians, you have to kind of hear in your head Nazis, Hamas. Here, the kind of people that would turn other human beings into something less than human and torture them and murder them and enslave them. And that's our attitude about the Egyptians in the Haggadah. And yet, when the Talmud comes along and says, when we're free, when the sea closes in on those tormentors and they drown, the Talmud says, pictures God saying, that's my creation too. Don't sing to me about their destruction. And it doesn't mean we wish we weren't free. It doesn't mean we wish the Passover never happened. It doesn't mean we have some sort of guilt about winning the war. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means recognize in our enemies that they have an element of humanity as well. This midrash is amazing too, and I really recommend people read it and discuss it at their seders. It's amazing because it gets ritualized at the seder. Do you know how? We turn this, even if we don't read this midrash, we turn the idea of this midrash into a ritual act at the seder. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'll bet you do. Sarit, do you want to take a swing at it? For some reason, your box lit up on my screen.
Yes, because I wanted to refer to the previous Ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva.
Wait. First,
But it's included.
let's answer this question, though. First, let's answer this question. When do you ritualize this idea of those Egyptians, those are God's creation too? I'll tell you when. That when you recite the 10 plagues at the Seder, what do you do with your cup of wine?
We are putting our hand.
Everybody does it a different way, right? Some
Yes.
people take drops of wine out with their fingers. Some people pour
Yes.
drops of wine out. Some people take a fork or a spoon, whatever. Everybody does it a different way, but everybody does it. But do you stop and think about what that ritual means? That ritual means wine, a glass of wine, always and forever in a Jewish ritual is a symbol of joy and celebration. It's a symbol of rejoicing. And that ritual act at that moment says we are diminishing from our cup of joy. Why? Because we recognize that those Nazis, they suffered also in this war. And we're not saying we wish it didn't happen. We're not saying we wish we didn't win or that we wish we weren't free. We're just saying we recognize their essential humanity. And by the way, I am not saying that I personally in my life can live up to this ethical ideal. I think this is an astonishingly radical ethic that Judaism thrusts in front of us, but one worth aspiring to and reaching to. I know I can't live up to that, but it's a aspirational challenge that our tradition thrusts into our lap. Sarit, back to you.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to the question, who is right, Rabbi Akiva or Shimon ben Azai?
Yeah.
I think it's not a matter of right, but for me, Adam b'tzelem Elohim, it's like we granted the soul, the brain, the ethics of the divine. And Ben Azai is referring to the general ethics in which Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is including in this phrase. I do not remember exactly how he phrased it in Hebrew. So this is my take.
The klal laprat. says the tradition, right? We've got a general principle and we've got the specific lesson of each one from.
Exactly. And he didn't specific what kind of a human being, if it's an enemy or not enemy, Israelites, it's in general. It's in general. So is ואהבת לרעך כמוך.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Beautifully said. Rabbi Goldstein, I'm going to share one more idea tonight before we're all done. Is that okay?
Please, you could share 10 if you wanted, but I'm gonna.
Well, I'm aware of
I'm
the
loving
time.
this. I love this.
Me too. Thank you. And I'm glad we have more in
More
weeks ahead.
sessions to come. And by the way, well, then let me just say that before you say it, just to what, you can like close with a great idea. So I don't have to like, that can be the way we bring it. Just want you to know that February 7th is our next session with Rabbi Gold. February 7th, that is again on Monday. And he'll be teaching on a class on when the stranger resides among us.
Right.
So-
Who's a biblical stranger. Yeah.
Yeah, the ger. So continue, Rabbi Gold.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Well, listen, like I said, this packet I've given you has a lot of wonderful texts in it, all sorts of permutations of what this idea means in Jewish ethics. For instance, on page 6 there, I'm just kind of like pointing them out to you to read later, is one about self-care. Lest we forget, God forbid, that when we talk about every human being made in the image of God, that means ourselves as well. And there's a beautiful text here from the Midrash about you have a responsibility to treat yourself with that dignity and honor that we're pointing at outwardly towards other people as well, lest we forget. There's some funky texts here about what about people who we just can't stand? Or even worse than that, what about people who are our outright enemies and want to do us harm? Like we saw, lest we forget in the midst of all these glorious texts that we have real enemies out there, people who want to hurt us, like we saw in Colleyville last week, lest we forget. But the text I really wanted to show you is here towards the end. There's a question that's raised. We went to the ethical lessons pretty quickly tonight, and naturally enough, why not? But there's a question raised. So if the human being is made in the image of God, what part of the human being is in that image? Does that literally mean that God physically looks like me, like you, like her, like him? It's a little bit of a whimsical question, but sometimes a whimsical question is asked in order to pose a profound answer. And there's a Hasidic tradition from the Jewish spiritual traditions here to say how when you look at another human being, it helps you contemplate and even meditate on this idea. So this text from the Talmud talks about the human soul being the part that really reflects the divine, because bodies are gross and bodies decay and bodies get old and get sick and fall apart. And God doesn't do any of those things. So it must be the spiritual part of the human being, the soul part, that really reflects this divine image. And that's a nice lesson. But there's another tradition that says, when you gaze at another human being, you can visualize God's presence in the world. Like this image that I gave for you at the top of what page? At the top of page 9, where I took the 4-letter name of God and arranged it, instead of horizontally, arranged it vertically. Yud Hey Vav Hey is the ineffable personal name of God, as it were, found in the Torah, the name that we don't pronounce, but we say as Adonai. And there's an old spiritual tradition that says, if you arrange it vertically with the Yud at the top and the Hey with arms hanging down and the Vav as a torso and a second Hey as waist and legs, that you can picture in the shape of a human being, the mystical name of God. For that matter, there's one of the great Hasidic masters. His name was Reb Naftali of Ropshitz. I love him not just because of his beautiful spirituality and his ethics, but also because I like saying Ropshitz. He has a tradition that says you can also look into another human being's face. And when you look into that person's face, you can see the name of God. The way in which he gets there is a little bit convoluted, but I'm going to sum it up. You know that the first thing, if I said, tell me something that Judaism teaches us about God, we might naturally enough say, well, I know that God is one. I learned that from the Shema. Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel, Adonai is one. And you know that in Hebrew, one is an aleph, the first letter. So I put an aleph here at the bottom of the page. And if you ever looked closely at a letter aleph, especially in a Torah scroll, when you're back in the sanctuary, God willing, someday soon with Rabbi Goldstein, peer into the Torah scroll and see how a letter aleph is really composed of three parts. It's composed of two letter yuds and a letter vav that's like arranged diagonally here. Do you see it? Here's a vav that's on the diagonal and an upside down yud and a right side up yud. Yud, yud, vav. All encompassed in the letter aleph. God is one. Well, what Reb Naftali of Ropshitz teaches is you can see that when you're looking to a person's face. He sees the yud and the vav, and maybe even I would imagine a hey as a mouth, but as the eyes and nose in the shape of a human being. All of which is his way of saying, can you visualize when you encounter another person, especially in a time and place where you're not feeling so spiritual, that that person is the divine image walking around in the world? And if so, how does that affect the way you talk, the way you act, the way you behave? I'll give you one more example of this illustration of Reb Naftali's point, and then we'll call it a night. I learned this from my teacher, Rabbi Eugene Borowitz of blessed memory. Rabbi Borowitz said, here's a spiritual exercise for you. The next time you find yourself in a crowded place, well, during the pandemic, we should all be blessed sometime soon to find ourselves in a crowded place, right? But use a little imagination. You're in a crowded place, or you're on a crowded Zoom screen or whatever. And maybe you find yourself in a place where you're really kind of flustered, like you're waiting in line at the supermarket or at the bank, and you're in a rush and you're flustered and you really wish these annoying people would get out of the way or something like that. And Rabbi Borowitz taught us this. As you're standing there, quietly look from face to face of the people that you encounter and say quietly to yourself, image of God, image of God, image of God, image of God. And he says it's a profound spiritual exercise, and see if it doesn't change the way you speak, the way you act,
Rabbi Gold,
the way you interact with other people over the course of your day. And that's the lesson. Yes, Paul. You muted yourself, Paul.
I muted you, Paul. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay.
if you look at the face of a multi-murderer who is about to be executed, and I'm looking at his face,
Yeah.
I should remember then at this point that he is in the image of God.
Well, that's a fair question. I would say two things. I would say, first of all, don't discount the lesson, because 99.999999% of the people you encounter in the world are not mass murderers. And secondly, I would say, yes, think about the tragedy of a wasted life, because this human being too was made once in the image of God. And what a tragedy unfolded here because of how that got squelched. Those are my two responses to that natural enough question. Yes. And remember Genesis chapter 9 that says one of the lessons of in the image of God is the abhorrence and horror of the crime of murder. That's one of the takeaways. So that's the best I can do with your powerful question there, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi Goldstein?
I think you've
I
done a
think that's a good
phenomenal
place
job,
to-
and I'm so grateful to you. For me personally, it's just because I just love learning new stuff, and you've taught a lot of great stuff. I mean, I think some very radical things here, which are really, really worthy, and I am so grateful, and I can't wait till we come together again next time.
Thank
So
you. It's
be
such
well,
an
my
honor
friend.
to be with you all tonight. I'm really grateful.
Dash Cham to Heidi, and I'll talk with you soon.
Neil, do not go. I want to talk with you. Just one recommendation.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, thank you all so much. You're
Yes.
welcome to. No more teaching. You can exit from the Zoom at this point.
Lila
Thank you.
Tov,
Thank you very much, Neil, for a
nice to meet you, sir.
beautiful presentation. I know that you read Hebrew fluently. Do you?
Hey, Ani?
Can.
Ken.
So
I'm thinking back about those days in Ulpan.
we know that on May 21, a new book came out by Tomer Persico. Do you know who is he?
I do. Yeah.
Oh, so he wrote a book,
What's the book?
Adam B'Tselem Elohim. So you
Oh.
have it.
But I didn't know the book. I have another book by him.
And I know,
On my bookshelf right here.
Zehuyot Yehudiyot, something with Zehuyot Yehudiyot. No, but this is a new book that came out on May 21. You should read it. I didn't read it. I didn't read it, but I did. It's on my list to read it, but I read a lot about it. And as I saw your topic for today, I thought about it.
Yeah, he's written some interesting stuff about human rights and about
Yes.
about the radical right-wing movement in Israel.
He's an
Mishichut.
activist. Yes, he's an activist, but I think that he's very well presenting his stuff.
You know, the idea of Mishichut is a big area of interest of mine and a study of mine, and he's written a lot of interesting stuff about that, especially about the dangers of too much messianism in Judaism. So yeah, thank you for that. I'll look for it.
Okay.
All right,
Yefema,
Lila Tov.
thank you so much, Lila Tov. Be well,
Okay.
everyone. See you
Good
at the next
night.
session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Neil, nice, my
Yeah.
friend. Nice. I mean, really great start. I just feel like it was such a. Oh, you know what? Let me turn the video, the stream.